everyone. Welcome to another episode of Wizard Goes Boom. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about Hex Crawls. What is a Hex Crawl, and is it a valid form of play? So what is a Hex Crawl, and how does it relate to the OSR and old school play? And is a Hex Crawl even a style of play that is legitimate, or was it something that came up with the OSR? One of the criticisms that I've heard about Hex Crawl play is that it was something that kind of was an idealized style of play described by the OSR, that nobody really remembers playing like that, and maybe they didn't. I know personally I don't remember doing Hex Crawls. The only one I remember doing would be Module X1, the Isle of Dread, which was made for Hex Crawls. That was a level 4 to 14 adventure in the wilderness, and that's really what a hex crawl is. Just like you have a dungeon crawl, which is you're crawling through those squares that represent 5 to 10 feet. A hex crawl is wilderness exploration, and that's going through a hex map, usually about 5 to 6 miles per hex. You can make them even smaller, but usually not bigger than a 6-mile hex. So I would think that if X1 was a module about doing a hex crawl on Overland, that it must have been a legitimate style of play back in the day. And there's a lot more evidence that it was in fact a legitimate style of play, stemming from the wargaming roots of D&D. One example would be the use or the suggestion of using Outdoor Survival from Avalon Hill as an outdoor map. It kind of implies, in fact, that it's probably the default setting for original Dungeons and Dragons. So back in 1972, Avalon Hill created a survival game with a hex map called Outdoor Survival, and it's a hex crawl. And in fact, it's listed as one of the suggested materials in the Men and Magic booklet of the original 3 books, 3 little brown books, which make up original Dungeons and Dragons. And on page 15 of Underworld and Wilderness booklet, it says, "The terrain beyond the immediate surroundings of the dungeon area should be unknown to all but the referee. Offhand adventures in the wilderness are made on the Outdoor Survival playing board, explained below. Exploratory journeys, such as expeditions to find land suitable for a castle or in search of some legendary treasure, are handled in an entirely different manner. Outdoor Survival has a playing board perfect for general adventures. Catch basins are castles, buildings are towns, and the balance of the terrain is as indicated, etc., etc." The key here is where it says exploratory journeys, such as expeditions or search of some legendary treasure. This really implies, or explicitly states, in fact, that hex crawling is a legitimate form of play and encouraged. So it's not just something the OSR just kind of recently came up with. If anything, they rediscovered it. The implication was supposed to be that once you're done with your starter dungeon, which will probably be nearby your starter town, which is your party's home base, that if you want to go looking for more lucrative and dangerous dungeons, you're going to have to travel outside on the hex map, to do some exploration or to follow up on some rumors or adventure hooks. And the party's got to look around. Of course, the way that DMs ultimately did it was, well, you just get there. And you might have a random encounter or two on the way. But we never quite did the hex crawl portion of it. And one reason might have been that back in the old days, there wasn't much hex paper available. Graph paper you could easily get, hex paper not so much. And if you had hex paper, you had to photocopy it, which was kind of expensive at the time to do. Now it's dirt cheap, so you can easily do hex maps, not a big deal. And then there's the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, particularly Appendix B, which deals with random wilderness terrain. So if the players went off the beaten path and they wanted to do some exploration, there was actually a toolkit in the DMG, Appendix B, which allowed the Dungeon Master to generate the terrain. And then right after that was Appendix C, which would be the random monster encounters. So while you're out there exploring, you could randomly encounter a tribe of orcs or, a pride of lions or whatever. On page 47 of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, you also have procedures for adventures in the outdoors, land adventures. It specifically talks about hex crawls. It doesn't use that term, that's a modern term, but that's what it was, hex crawls. Hex crawl is also how you get from one module to another. Let's say you're playing in the world of Greyhawk and you want to get from, let's say, the Temple of Elemental Evil to, let's say, another module in the series, like the GDQ Adventure Path. Well, to get there, you would have to travel overland, and that's, the DM could certainly just flub it and say, you just get there and there's a couple of creatures that you encounter, blah, blah, blah. But the idea was that you're supposed to hex crawl your way to the next module location. And speaking of GDQ, particularly the D part of GDQ, which would be Descent into the Depths of the Earth, Shrine of the Quotoa, and Vault of the Drow, they also had subterranean hex crawls in them. Again, the implications were everywhere. But the simple fact was that hex crawls were a lot more dangerous than dungeon crawls. And the reason behind that is that dungeons were layered by difficulty level. So a first level party could, have a reasonable good challenge, but reasonable good chance to live on the first level of the dungeon. And then once they get to the second level of the dungeon, they should be second level, and so on. So there was a bit of balance there, but all of that balance just goes completely out the window with overland hex crawls. But that, I guess, is just part of the fun of a hex crawl, where you can encounter very dangerous things. There's also rules for engaging in such things, like when you come across a monster, there's also rules for avoiding such things. But the real fun of it was the exploration and finding things. What if you found a new ruin, a new dungeon, a magical fountain, or a magical forest? Who knows? These were the kinds of things that you wouldn't find in a dungeon. So I think, all said and done, yes, hex crawling is a legitimate form of play, and it's been there since the beginning. Although many DMs, for various different reasons, maybe for expediency, didn't use the hex crawling rules, I would say the OSR did not invent the hex crawl. They rediscovered it, because it's always been there in the old books. So hex crawls are indeed a legitimate form of play. And it shouldn't be the only kind of play. It should be something to add to your game. Give it a try. See how the hex crawl goes. Use the tools in the 1E DMG, or there's plenty of other tools out there. Another tool is the sandbox generator, which is available on DriveThruRPG. There's a ton of them out there. Well, thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you have a pleasant day.